When I look at Warhammer as an IP, I see a confusing mess of different types of media that I can't imagine myself ever fully getting invested in because of how massively expansive it is. I mean, where do you even begin with this stuff? There's the tabletop game with the miniatures, animated videos, hundreds upon hundreds of books, and a plethora of video games, many of which are absolute dog shit because it seems as though almost anyone can make a Warhammer game. And even some of the ones that are really good, like Darktide, seem to barely scratch the surface of what this world is about, especially since many of the games, like that one, don't even feature what is clearly the face of the Warhammer series, the Space Marines. So when I saw that Saber Interactive, makers of one of my favorite co-op games, World War Z, were making a Space Marine game, and that it looked damn good, I said to myself, I'm going to try to get into Warhammer. And so, in preparation for this game coming out, that's exactly what I did. My intention was to learn a little bit more about Warhammer overall before Space Marine 2 launched, so I'd have a better understanding of what I'd be heading into. So I played more of the games, the original Space Marine, Boltgun, Dawn of War, this Mad Max racing one for some reason, this one where you're playing football for some reason. If anything, these last two just made things even more confusing. I listened to an old man read me one of the books and mostly understood what was going on in it. I even went to the place with the name on it, and they let me sit there for like 2 hours and paint one of the little guys for free, which came out pretty damn good if I do say so myself. And don't get me wrong, all of this was a lot of fun, and it did help me understand the series a bit more, but I still felt like I was missing something, like I wasn't fully in on the joke. What was it that people found so appealing about this series? Well, my friends, it wasn't until I actually sat down and played Space Marine 2 where I finally went, oh my god, I get it. Space Marine 2 is a damn good video game. Let me just get that right out of the way. And it's also probably the best entry point for someone who's interested in getting into Warhammer, at least from the video game side of things. At a surface level, this is a game where you run around as a big muscly dude and just shoot, slash, and smash the hell out of everything in your path. Kind of like Gears of War, but in space. Third-person shooter, check. Big, burly, boys, check. Weapons with fucking chainsaws attached to them?
You're goddamn right.
But it's also more than that. This is the most video game feeling video game I've played in years, and from what I've heard around the World Wide Web, this seems to be a unanimous opinion. But what do we all mean by this? Well, it's the gameplay that feels reminiscent of games from the early to mid 2000s. It's the inclusion of 3 different modes, having a campaign, a mission mode, and a multiplayer mode, that were almost always present in these types of games back in the day. It's the lack of a battle pass or an in-game shop that you have to spend real money on, to buy fictional money, to buy whatever fucking cosmetic of the week is in the rotation. You get my point? And even with it having the titles of Warhammer and Space Marine 2 being from a franchise you might not know about, and a sequel to a game that both you and the majority of people watching this video most likely did not play, does not matter, because the gameplay you will experience here is just that good. Of course, if you did play it, there will be moments that will make you do the Leonardo DiCaprio pointing meme when they reference something that happened.
I've seen it before, on a planet named Gaia.
He said it! He said it!
So if you also want to experience this but don't feel like sitting through an additional 6 hours of an old game, just go watch all the cutscenes online. My point is though, that regardless of prior knowledge, if you play this game, you will have a good time. Period. In Space Marine 2, you play as Dimitri and Titus, one of the hulking Space Marines of the 41st millennium. Massive, almost godlike super soldiers that are treated as such by the puny regular humans you fight alongside with. This story takes place about 100 years after the original game, the events of which led to Titus being cast out from the Ultramarines, one of the groups of Space Marines that are known as a chapter within this world. But in a more simplistic sense, the blue ones. After being accused of heresy at the end of the first game, Titus was tortured, interrogated, and put into stasis, and when finally set free, decided not to return to the Ultramarines, believing he had brought shame to them for his actions. He instead went on to shed his identity by serving in the Death Watch, a group made up of different members of various Space Marine chapters. And it's here where Space Marine 2's story begins, being deployed to the planet Kadaku to fend off against the Terranid Swarm, a species of alien that moves in enormous groups, behaving like a hive mind. After losing your entire squad of Death Watch brothers, Titus is saved from the brink of death and is recruited once again by the Ultramarines. Back again, he must now prove himself to his battle brothers who are hesitant of his shadowy past. And yes, they are called battle brothers. It says it right there on the loading screen. Now, a lot of that probably went right over your head, and by the Emperor of Mankind, I would not even have attempted to learn most of this stuff had I not needed to for this video to make sense. I will say though, that what is here is pretty damn good, and when I compare the writing here to other Warhammer games that I have played, it's like night and day. No offense to Darktide, I love you, but I have a max level Ogre in that game, and I still have no idea what the fuck happened in that story. But even if you aren't able to follow along with this plot completely, since there are a few sections where they dump lore at you, you'll still understand who these characters are, how they feel about each other, and what drives them. One of the primary threads of this story follows the dynamic between the three main characters, Titus, Gadriel, and Chiron, and their ongoing relationship is what I enjoyed the most from this plot. Titus leading the three of them, being reluctant to speak about his past, Gadriel rightfully not trusting in his new leader for keeping secrets from them, and Chiron who follows Titus without question, but slowly tries to get him to open up. It's not an incredibly deep story, but by the end of it I think you'll at least care about these characters. While the original game had you fighting mainly against orcs, the Tyranids are a whole different ballgame, and one of the coolest things you'll see is the absolute ridiculous number of them present on screen at the same time. This is Saber Interactive's swarm technology at work, first used in their game World War Z, and is something that you will never get tired of seeing. Throughout the game, you'll encounter many sections that will task you with defending against them, and there are always these huge moments that begin with you watching as thousands of these things just pour out towards you, with the only thought in your mind being that you're gonna have to be the one to stop all of them. And from the gameplay you've seen so far, you might be thinking that you can just spam the attack button over and over again to win, but you really can't do that. The moment-to-moment gameplay here is actually surprisingly nuanced, even for the sections like this one where you're being assaulted from every angle. Almost every enemy attack in this game can be parried, and upon doing so successfully, you will get to take a free shot at the enemy, meaning that you'll always be looking for these moments where you can minimize the damage you're taking by parrying or dodging around enemies. And if you see one of these blue parry markers coming from one of the smaller enemies, a well-timed button press will do this. You have both health and armor meters, and when you lose health, you either need to use stims that you'll come across as you traverse the levels, or activate Titus' special ability that makes him both regain lost health and become much stronger for a short period of time. Armor on the other hand works a bit differently. Your armor meter will break before your health begins to drain, but to replenish this, you must kill enemies using a finisher. Do enough damage to one of them and they will begin flashing red, meaning that they're ready to be executed. And I love these. Your armor will always deplete first, so you'll constantly be wanting to regain it, meaning that you'll be executing enemies at every available instance. And watching as your Space Marine just fucking destroys these guys in some of the most badass animations you've ever seen never gets old. That's a pretty quick rundown of how the fighting works, and you'll be doing a lot of it throughout the course of the 8 to 10 hour campaign, which is not crazy long, but what I'd still consider a solid amount of time for a game like this. It can also be played solo with AI companions, or these spots can be filled by 2 of your friends who will play as Gadriel or Chiron for a total of 3 players. While most of this game is just shooting and meleeing tons of bad guys, you will additionally have these neat little sections that will sprinkle in something else to change up the flow of gameplay a bit, like giving you a jetpack that you can use to both navigate around more vertical levels and slam down into enemies with, or throwing you into a confined space with these rat-like creatures that will constantly try to close in on you, but putting a flamethrower in your hands in order to keep them back. The fighting also gets shaken up a bit around midway through the campaign, when you're introduced to a new enemy faction, the Forces of Chaos, who offer up a slightly different kind of fight over the Tyranids, since these guys like to shoot back at you much more. This is because their main combatants are the Chaos Space Marines, who are essentially the Warriors of the 40K world. Every time you finish a mission, you'll end up back here at the battle barge. This is your base of operations, and is where you'll be fed lots of story bits that you most likely will not understand. At first I was kinda like, ugh, I gotta walk around here between missions, but as I went, I really came to like this area, especially because it doesn't feel static. You leave for missions at the launch bay, but walking over there is always a treat. One time I was heading to my next mission, and a ship just came flying in looking absolutely battered, with no real plot relevance from what I understood. It was just something cool for the player to look at. And it's this kind of stuff that makes this world feel really alive. Almost everywhere you look, whether that's around the battle barge or during one of the missions, something is always happening. Random characters will be having full conversations with one another. A captain might be rallying his troops with a speech before a big fight, while traitors are being executed by their former comrades nearby. At one point during a mission, I peered off the side of a building and saw some Marines fighting against the Tyranids way off in the distance. And much to my delight, I was able to shoot at them all the way from where I was, which was just really neat. So those are my thoughts on the story, the campaign, and the gameplay. But like I said earlier, there are 2 additional modes. Eternal War, which is a 6v6 multiplayer mode, and the mission-based Operations mode. Operations are 6 standalone levels that can also be played with up to 3 players, but instead of filling the comically sized boots of Titus and company, you fill the comically sized boots of one of 6 different classes of Space Marine. The cool thing about these missions though is that they're all happening concurrently with the campaign story. During a few big moments throughout the campaign, these really cool sounding plot devices are teased at you. Like, remember how I mentioned that the Terranas work as a hive mind? Well, that's because one creature is controlling them all. So when you hear about this, you assume you're going to be the one to go kill them as Titus. But then randomly he's like,
I'm putting together a special team. We're going to be doing one thing and one thing only. Killing
Xenos!
and sends these guys off to go kill it instead. Operations are where you get to see these events play out. You'll hear the same conversations you had through the comms playing as Titus, but from the other side.
Delta Wing, box check.
Iridium here, still on our gunship. Thalassa has landed, and soon a tyrant will fall.
And the first thing I'd say about the missions here is that they're much more involved than those from the campaign. An example of this would be how in one of them, you have to lead this cart down a track with a player needing to be near it for it to move, while at the same time, some tracks have to have their orientation swapped for it to move along. And this was really cool for just how different it was. If I was going to compare the missions from this mode with those from the campaign in terms of replayability, these ones have without a doubt been made to be played multiple times. And I say that for several reasons. First off, unlike the campaign where you need to invite your friends in order to play co-op, this mode has matchmaking built in. So you'll always have a different experience if you play online, since you'll be paired up with new people who will probably create a new combination of 3 classes with you. These levels also don't always have the same events play out every time. In one level, my squad and I came across some Marines that needed reinforcements, but the next time I played it, they weren't even there. Another mission I had gone through many times, but around my 4th playthrough of it, this boss randomly spawned in, which I didn't even know could happen. And it's moments like these that will make you want to play through it again, especially when you try playing through them all as the different classes. There are 6 classes in Operations, all of which can only use a specific set of weapons, but come paired with an ability that's completely unique to them. The Tactical class is your jack of all trades, giving you options to use all sorts of different weapons and playing the most like Titus from the campaign. His ability is the Auspex scan, which both highlights enemies and makes them easier for you and your team to kill. The Assault class is decked out with one of those cool jetpacks, which serves as his ability. Here though, you're limited to using only a pistol and a melee weapon. So because of this, he's one of the classes that work best when you're in the center of the fight smashing enemies. Additionally, he's the only class that can wield the wide swinging Thunderhammer, which is my favorite weapon in the game because duh. The Vanguard's ability is his grapple launcher, which lets you reel yourself in towards enemies, giving them a swift kick to the face. He also has access to the more ranged primary weapons, and since he's the most mobile, he pairs very well with the quick to use combat knife. The Bulwark gets a big ol' shield that you can use to shove or block enemies, pretty much making you an indestructible wall. While he can't use any primary weapons, he's the only class that can wield the Power Sword, which is a very distinct weapon in that it can be charged up, making you swing a bit slower but hit much harder. And his ability, the Chapter Banner, replenishes armor for you and any nearby teammates. The Sniper is self-explanatory. You get access to the sniping weapons, and his ability is the Camo Cloak, which makes you invisible for a short time, which you can use to revive down teammates, line up your next shot, or sneak up on enemies, with the added bonus being that the first hit of damage you give while cloaked will be much greater. Finally, the Heavy doesn't have access to any melee weapons, but in return gets to bring out all the big guns. His ability, Iron Halo, blocks any incoming shots while letting you and your team shoot back through it. And these are just some very quick descriptions of them at the most basic level. What also makes Operations mode even more replayable is that there's a progression system. As you play, you will individually level up these classes, gaining points that you can use to make them and the weapons they wield more powerful. Some of these perks buff your Space Marine or the ability they use, and others benefit your entire team. For example, one of the later ones in the Assault class's perk tree makes your jump pack recharge 10% with every kill you get from a ground pound, and this stacks, so if you're using it on a large group of enemies, you can just keep slamming down into them over and over again. So pretty much the more you play this mode, the stronger you'll become, letting you tackle the harder difficulties, which means access to more advanced perks, etc. So the gameplay loop here is quite fulfilling, and it gives you a real incentive to continue playing. Kind of a random note, but I also just like the fact that each class is their own person. Like, they're not just empty husks for you to play as, they all have their own personality. And it's shown through the dialogue that they all have with each other depending on which of the 3 classes are present during the mission.
Decimus, if you observe the rites of reverence with half the devotion you wield a chainsaw, you would be an exemplar of our chapter.
Reciting lengthy liturgies is no substitute for killing Xenos.
And yet, I find the time for both.
Ha! If you would like to test how your devotions compare to mine, my blade is ready anytime.
The Heavy is also pretty funny. He's 100% no nonsense to a comical degree, and I always enjoy hearing what he has to say because of it.
Engage standard morale boost.
For the Emperor!
The final mode is Eternal War, the 6v6 multiplayer mode. And I'll be honest, I really can't believe how into this multiplayer I am. As I've aged, I've seen many competitive multiplayer games that I've really enjoyed slowly die, and watched as both my fingers and reaction time have begun to fail me in comparison to the 12-year-olds on these games with unlimited time. So because of that, I've begun to gravitate away from such modes in favor of the cooperative ones. Enter me with a shocked Pikachu face upon realizing how damn enjoyable this mode is. The multiplayer here is the definition of the word basic. It's only 6v6, not a ton of maps, and just 3 game modes to pick from. But I think it's because of this simplicity that has kept me jumping back into it whenever I have a free 15 minutes. The classes I mentioned before all carry over here, but without any of the upgrades for balance reasons. And you can get quite tactical here if you want to. The game even only allows for 2 of each class to be present on one team, so it stays fairly balanced. For me though, I find that this is just one of those multiplayer games where you just run the fuck in there, kill a few guys, get killed yourself, and repeat until the match is over. And so far that's worked out pretty well. But fighting real people in this game is definitely much different than fighting aliens. It's a lot more sweaty. You'll probably find yourself doing that Dark Souls boss roll thing when someone gets a little too close to you, but I will say it does make for some pretty entertaining gameplay. And you know, random multiplayer modes like this just don't happen in games anymore, even though they used to be everywhere. Like, it was always the 3 modes: the campaign, some kind of cooperative thing, and multiplayer. Nowadays, either a game exists because it is a multiplayer game, or it just doesn't have it to begin with. But I think this one is going to last, because it's not super complex, and it's just pure, genuine fun. You're not playing it to level yourself up through a battle pass, you're playing it to show those damn 12-year-olds that you've still got it!
And fuck yourself. You sniveling little shitbrag.
That's not to say you aren't earning anything though, because as you play both this and the operations mode, you'll gain currency that can be used to unlock more colors or pieces of armor for all your Space Marines. The best way I can describe the customization in this game is that it feels like how I felt when I was sitting at the Warhammer shop painting my guy, being able to specifically choose where I wanted certain colors to go, and because of that I was able to recreate them almost one-to-one. Helmets, chest pieces, shoulder pads, and the emblems of which chapter you want your Space Marine to align themselves with are all things you can pick here. But you can also isolate and color each of these pieces however you want, allowing you to make some pretty cool looking designs. Although, because everything is perfectly balanced as all things should be, you'll probably see some members of the Skittles chapter running around the battlefield as well.
You will taste the rainbow!
But honestly, I freaking love this. I feel like I'm a kid again playing a match of Halo 3 after school, watching as my Power Ranger color-coded team runs towards the enemy. Buzz Lightyear looking ass.
To infinity and beyond!
And being creatively challenged isn't an excuse here either, as Saber did their homework and made it so that you can deck out your guy perfectly in the colors of one of the 18 established chapters. You just unlock the different components that make up their design, and bam, you are now a member of the Space Wolves, or the Blood Ravens, or the Doom Eagles, or Aristocrat Frogs. One of those I may or may not have made up. And if you couldn't tell from everything you've been seeing, this game also just looks good, with the attention to detail here being absolutely insane at times. And I know most people don't really care that much about the look of a video game in this day and age, but it's a bit hard to ignore how impressive this game is in its visual presentation. There is detail in everything. The characters, the battlefields, the architecture. There's a photo mode in this game that I messed around with for a bit, so maybe looking at some of the wicked pictures I took will help give you a better idea of what I'm talking about. So what of the future for this game? If you've been a fan of my channel, which I know you're not, then you may have seen a little video about a game I mentioned earlier called World War Z, which I know you didn't, but in that video, I talk about how committed Saber Interactive were to that game, releasing new content for it over the course of half a decade. Like, they literally just announced new content for that game a few weeks ago, and it came out in like 2019. Some of the content for that game was paid DLC, but a lot of it was completely free. You would come back to the game after a few months, and a new enemy would have been added, or a new weapon, or a map. And looking at Saber Interactive's roadmap for this game, it seems they'll be going in a similar direction. At the moment, there is a season pass for this game, but the only thing in it is cosmetic DLC. And Saber have come out and said that this is how DLC will work here. You might see some new colors added for customization that you will need to pay for, but anything gameplay related will be free for all players through updates. Some of the free things players can look forward to are new PvE missions, new enemies, new weapons, and a horde mode, which I'm really looking forward to because they've already shown that they can do it very well. And looking back at how they treated a game based on a random ass zombie movie, you can bet that they'll probably treat Space Marine 2 with the same kind of love and care. They've actually already released one of these new operation maps within less than a month and a half, so that's a pretty good sign for things to come. At the beginning of this video, I talked about all the different ways I went about trying to prepare for this game, by learning more about the world that it's set in. But after playing through it to completion, I've realized that this probably would have been the best way to first experience it. And oh boy, I am in it now. I'm watching all the lore videos, I got my little set of guys that I'm going to try to paint when I have some more free time, I'm about to start the second Eisenhorn book, and I also find myself consistently yelling out the word "Bruh" when I boot this game up. This might be presumptuous of me to say, but based on all the different Warhammer games I have played, and the reactions I've seen from others, I think this will go down as one of the best Warhammer video games ever to be made. If I was going to use a word to describe my time in Space Marine 2, it would be nostalgic, which I actually find quite surprising, given that I'm still kind of a newbie to this whole thing. But it really did make me feel like I was thrown back into like 2008, playing Gears of War with my friends. This was such a refreshing experience, through the campaign, the operations, and the multiplayer modes, to the point that I am genuinely excited for what is to come in the future for this game.
The Codex Astartes does not support this action. But I am looking forward to it.
So, if you're like me and you weren't a fan of Warhammer before playing Space Marine 2, well, you might just become one afterward.
Titus, accused of heresy. You will never know redemption until you have faced the judgment of your brothers.
There are those who would see you sent back to the Inquisition. Tread carefully, brother.
Prove yourself to us and know true absolution.
Chaos is here if they get their hands on this thing. We won't let that happen.
Brothers, let them feel the wrath of the Ultramarines! Tyranids, hold them back, damn it!
Death to Xenos! I am death, servant of the Emperor, and you will taste my wrath. If we die with vengeance on our lips! I will not rest until every last vile heretic lies dead at my feet!